My sister dumped her 2 toddlers on my doorstep, promised she'd return when my niece turned 18, and drove away laughing, never once imagining I would destroy her entire world in return. My doorbell rang like someone was trying to break it off the frame. I opened the door and found my younger sister Renee standing on my porch with 2 rolling suitcases and 2 terrified toddlers. Piper was 3. Grady had just turned 2. Renee was already backing toward her car before I'd said a word. "You're single, Dana. You're 34. You've got the extra bedroom and the flexible schedule," she said, like she was reading off a checklist. "These kids need somebody who actually shows up for them. I'll come get them when Piper turns 18. I told her that made no sense, that she couldn't possibly mean 15 years. She was already at her car door. "Bedtime is 8, she called over her shoulder, laughing like she'd told a joke. "Don't mess it up, Dana Marie." Then she got into her gray Honda and drove off down Larchwood Court like she had somewhere important to be. Piper started crying first. Grady followed 30 seconds later, the kind of crying that comes from a kid who doesn't understand what's happening, only that his mother's car is gone, and a stranger's living room is where he's supposed to sleep now. The suitcases she'd left behind were the small, wheeled kind meant for a weekend trip, not a childhood. I found out later, unzipping them on my bedroom floor that first night, while Piper and Grady slept tangled together in my guest bed because neither of them would settle alone, that Renee had packed exactly 4 days of clothes, mismatched socks, a single stuffed rabbit missing one ear that belonged to Piper, and nothing at all for Grady to sleep with. No comfort object, no favorite blanket, nothing. I sat on my bedroom floor at midnight, matching tiny socks that didn't match, and thinking, with a kind of numb, disbelieving clarity, that whatever Renee had told herself this arrangement was, she hadn't packed it like someone planning to be gone 15 years, or even 15 days. She'd packed it like someone leaving for the weekend and simply never planning to think about the return trip at all. I called Renee 11 times in the first hour, straight to voicemail every time. I texted her 3 separate messages, each one longer and more desperate than the last. Her only reply came 40 minutes later. "Stop being so dramatic. This is good for you and good for them. Good for me." I had a 3-year-old sobbing into my couch cushions and a 2-year-old who wouldn't stop screaming long enough to be held. My sister had vanished into a garage studio 20 minutes across town, chasing a music career her ex-husband used to bankroll, and she'd left me holding 2 children I hadn't seen in 8 months. I am 34 years old. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a 3-bedroom house I bought myself 6 years ago with money I saved working as a forensic accountant for a regional credit union. I audit loan files for fraud patterns. I read financial statements the way other people read novels, looking for the sentence that doesn't belong. I mention this now because it matters later. At the time, standing in my living room with 2 crying kids and a soaked couch cushion, none of that training helped me at all. I just picked Grady up and held him until he stopped shaking, and I let Piper hold onto my leg, and I ordered a pizza because it was the only thing I could think to do that a 3-year-old might find comforting. Our father left when I was 9 and Renee was 6, and I think that single fact explains more about both of us than either of us has ever said out loud to a therapist, let alone to each other. Carol raised us alone in a rented duplex in Gastonia, working a day shift at a furniture warehouse and a weekend shift bartending at a VFW hall, and she did it well enough that neither of us went without the things that mattered, but there wasn't much room left over for the things that didn't. I became the kid who managed logistics because somebody had to, and Renee, 3 years younger and therefore 3 years more shielded from the worst of those early scrambling years, became the kid who learned that if she cried hard enough or smiled charmingly enough or simply waited long enough, somebody older would eventually step in and handle it for her. I don't think Carol ever meant to raise us into those particular shapes. I think it's just what happens when a household runs on scarcity and improvisation for long enough. Renee is 31. She's 3 years younger than me, and growing up, we were close in the specific way sisters are close when one of them is always covering for the other. Our mother, Carol, worked 2 jobs most of our childhood, and I was the one who packed Renee's lunches and signed her permission slips when Mom couldn't get off work. I don't say that to make myself sound like a martyr. I say it because it's the shape our relationship took early, and it never really changed. Renee needed things. I provided them. That was the deal, even when nobody ever said it out loud. The extra bedroom Renee mentioned that afternoon on my porch wasn't just an empty room to her. It had been a nursery once, briefly, in my own head, if nowhere else. I was engaged for 2 years in my late 20s to a man named Corbin, who I'd planned a whole life around, including that room, which we'd picked paint swatches for on a Saturday afternoon in a Sherwin-Williams on South Boulevard. The engagement ended 9 months before the wedding, quietly and for reasons that don't matter much to this story, except that they left me alone in a house with a room I'd never repainted, still the pale, unfinished gray of primer, 6 years later. Renee knew all of this. She'd been the one who drove down from Dayton the week it ended, and sat with me on my kitchen floor eating gas station donuts at midnight, the last time I remember her showing up for me the way I'd spent a lifetime showing up for her. I've thought a lot, since October, about whether she remembered that room when she stood on my porch and called it an extra bedroom, whether some calculating part of her clocked it as convenient, or whether it was simpler and worse than that, whether she just didn't think about it at all. She married Julian Voss when she was 24. He was a logistics coordinator for a freight company, steady, unglamorous, the kind of man who showed up early and left late and never once made a scene about it. They had Piper 2 years into the marriage in April, and Grady followed 14 months after that. that. From the outside, it looked like a normal young family working through the normal chaos of 2 kids under 3. From the inside, I watched Renee slide further and further into a version of herself that scared me. She quit her job at a dental office 6 months after Piper was born, telling everyone she wanted to focus on music, on the guitar she'd played since she was 16, and always swore she'd take seriously one day. Julian supported it. He paid for a used PA system, a decent microphone, 4 months of studio time at a place called Ferris Sound on the east side of Dayton, Ohio, where they live. Renee posted videos. Most got under 200 views. She kept going anyway, and Julian kept paying, because that's what you do when you love someone and you think their dream is worth the mortgage payment being tight some months. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me, even now. Renee wasn't a bad mother in the dramatic, obvious way people picture when they hear a story like this. She read to Piper sometimes. She took Grady to the park when the weather was nice, but there was a pattern underneath the good days, and I saw it up close the Thanksgiving. Piper turned 2 when I drove up from Charlotte to spend 4 days with them in Dayton. Renee borrowed $3,000 from me that weekend. She said it was for a car repair, the transmission on the Honda, and she needed it fast because Julian didn't know how bad the car had gotten and she didn't want him worrying. I wired it to her the next morning. 11 months later, I found out from Julian, in an offhand comment that clearly meant nothing to him, that the transmission had been fine the whole time. He'd taken the car in himself in October. I never brought it up with Renee. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. I told myself a lot of things weren't worth the fight. That year and the years after it. There was another moment, smaller, that I didn't understand the weight of until much later. In February, when Piper was 2.5, Renee called me at 11 at night in a panic, saying she needed someone to watch the kids the next day because her regular sitter had canceled and she had a meeting with a producer she couldn't miss. I couldn't get off work on a day's notice, and I told her so. She found someone else instead, a woman she'd connected with through a local mom's Facebook group, someone she'd never met in person. No background check, no references beyond a profile picture and a friendly comment thread. Julian found out 3 weeks later, and they had what Renee described to me as a huge fight over nothing. At the time, I sided with Renee because that's what I always did. I told her Julian was overreacting, that plenty of parents use sitters they met online. Looking back, I understand now that wasn't overreacting. That was a man watching a pattern form and trying, in the only way he knew how, to stop it before it hurt his kids. There was a third incident, the one I think about most now, because it involved Julian's parents directly and should have warned all of us far earlier than it did. The March before Grady was born, Renee told the family she'd been accepted into a songwriting intensive in Nashville, a 4-day program she described as invitation only, exactly the kind of break her career needed. She said the program cost $1,800, non-refundable due within the week, and that Julian's income was already stretched too thin that month to cover it without dipping into their savings for Piper's daycare. Sandra and Ward, who adored Renee at the time and had no reason yet not to, wired the money directly to her within 2 days. Renee never went to Nashville. I know now, because Vivian's investigator eventually pulled the timeline as part of the fraud case, that she spent that week at home, and that the $1,800 went toward a down payment on studio equipment she'd been eyeing for months. At the time, all any of us knew was that she came back from what she called an incredible, life-changing week, with a new microphone and a story about a producer who'd promised to keep in touch. Nobody ever met the producer. Nobody ever heard from him. Sandra told me much later, after everything came apart, that she'd wondered about it once or twice over the years, and always talked herself out of the wondering, because Renee was, as she put it, just so believable when she wanted something. Renee and Julian separated when Grady was 14 months old, and Piper was 2 years and 8 months. The divorce finalized 11 months later, in September, a month before the day Renee showed up on my porch with 2 suitcases, and no plan beyond, "You'll figure it out." In the custody arrangement, Renee got the kids the majority of the time, largely because Julian's job had him doing overnight freight runs 3 nights a week, and his lawyer at the time hadn't fought hard enough on flexible scheduling. Julian moved back in with his parents, Sandra and Ward, in Columbus, Ohio, roughly 2 hours from Dayton, and he took every visitation day the court allowed him, plus extra whenever Renee would agree to it, which by the final year of their marriage was becoming less and less often. He called me sometimes, not often, mostly to ask how the kids were doing on weeks he didn't have them, because Renee had stopped answering his texts with anything beyond one-word replies. I didn't realize then how much that phone call habit would matter. I just thought he was a decent man trying to stay close to his kids from 2 hours away, doing the best he could with a system that hadn't been built to help him. By the time Renee's car disappeared down Larchwood Court that October afternoon, I hadn't seen Piper and Grady in 8 months. Renee had stopped visiting, stopped calling, stopped answering when I called her. I found out later she'd been telling our mother she was focusing on herself and healing from the divorce, which Carol, God love her, took at face value the way she took most things Renee said at face value. I didn't know Renee had quietly stopped paying her half of the kids' daycare costs 4 months earlier. I didn't know she'd let their pediatrician appointments lapse. I didn't know any of it because Renee had gotten very good over the years at only showing people the parts of her life that made her look like she had it together. I was about to learn just how much she'd been hiding and how much of it had nothing to do with music at all. I didn't decide to drive the kids to Ohio that same night. I want to be honest about that because the version of this story where I acted purely out of righteous fury isn't the the true version. I spent that first evening calling Renee, calling our mother, trying every reasonable channel before I did anything drastic. It was Piper who changed my mind, in a way she'll probably never remember. Around 9 that night, an hour past the bedtime Renee had shouted at me from her car window, Piper crawled into my lap on the couch, still sniffling, and asked in a small voice if her daddy knew where she was. I told her I didn't know. She said, "Daddy always comes. Not daddy would come. Not I hope daddy comes. Daddy always comes." That was a fact to her, stated the way kids state facts, without doubt. I thought about the last time Julian had called me, 3 weeks earlier, asking if I'd heard from Renee because she'd canceled his weekend visitation twice in a row with no explanation. I thought about how tired his voice had sounded. I packed the kids' bags that night, mismatched socks and all, and I called Julian at 6 the next morning. He answered on the second ring, which told me he probably hadn't been sleeping well either. I explained what had happened as calmly as I could manage, with Grady climbing on my kitchen counter behind me. There was a long silence on the line. Then Julian said, "I'm calling my parents. Can you get here today?" I told him I could. Sandra and Ward Voss live in a 4-bedroom house in Westerville, a suburb north of Columbus, the kind of house with a swing set already in the backyard from when Julian was a kid, and a guest room that Sandra keeps made up out of habit. It's a 6-hour drive from Charlotte. I did it in 5 hours and 40 minutes, stopping only for gas and a rest area bathroom break that turned into a 20-minute negotiation with a toddler who did not want to get back in his car seat. Julian opened the door before I'd even gotten both kids unbuckled. Piper saw him and took off across the front yard at a dead sprint, and Grady, who'd been fussy for the last hour of the drive, started laughing the second he spotted his father's face. Julian dropped to his knees on the grass and caught both of them at once. And I stood by my car and watched a man cry the kind of tears that had clearly been waiting a long time to come out. He looked up at me over Piper's shoulder and said, "She's about to learn what consequences feel like." I didn't know yet how right he was, or how much of what was coming had nothing to do with me at all. Sandra had 2 rooms ready within the hour, one with a toddler bed she'd apparently ordered online the moment Julian called her that morning. There was warm food on the table by 6 that evening, a pot roast Sandra had been planning to freeze that she pulled out instead. There were soft, worn picture books read slow and gentle at bedtime, the kind of unhurried reading that happens when nobody's checking their phone or half watching TV over a kid's shoulder. The next morning, Piper ate green beans without a fight for what Julian told me was the first time in recorded history. Grady slept through the night without a single tear, which Sandra said hadn't happened since the last time she'd had him for a weekend, back in the spring. These weren't broken kids. I want to be clear about that. They were just starved for a kind of stability that nobody in their daily life had been reliably giving them, and it turned out that starvation had a very fast cure. I called Renee that first night to tell her where the kids were. I thought, foolishly, that I was doing the responsible thing, informing her before she panicked and called the police thinking they'd been taken by a stranger. She didn't hear "the kids are safe." She heard "you no longer control this situation," and the difference in her reaction told me everything about what she actually cared about. She screamed at me for 4 straight minutes without pausing for breath. She called it kidnapping. She said she'd call the police and make sure I paid for this. I told her, as steadily as I could manage, that she was the one who had left 2 toddlers crying on a stranger's porch, because that's genuinely what it must have looked like to Piper and Grady in that moment. A stranger's porch, even though it was my own home, and driven away laughing. She hung up on me mid-sentence. 2 hours later, at 8:40 that night, 2 Westerville police officers knocked on the Vosses' door. Renee had called them herself, reporting that her children had been abducted by her ex-husband and her sister. I remember standing in Sandra's kitchen, listening through the doorway, my stomach in my throat, genuinely afraid for a moment that I'd made a terrible mistake. The younger officer asked Julian for identification. The older one, a woman named Officer Reyes, asked to see any communication I had from Renee. I pulled up the text on my phone, the one from the first afternoon. "Bedtime is 8. I'll grab them when Piper turns 18. Officer Reyes read it out loud, slowly, in the front hallway, with Renee's own words hanging in the air. She looked at her partner, then at me, and said this wasn't kidnapping. She used a different word, abandonment. She said it plainly, like she'd seen the pattern before and recognized it immediately, and she told Renee over the phone, in a call I could hear half of from across the room, that showing up with an accusation like that could open her up to far more scrutiny than she wanted, not less. Officer Reyes told me on her way out the door that night, almost as an aside, that she'd seen a version of this before, a parent who genuinely believed that giving birth to a child bought permanent, unconditional authority over what happened to them afterward, regardless of what they actually did with that authority day to day. I didn't know yet how precisely that observation would end up describing everything still ahead of us. That was the first ceiling. Renee broke through it 4 days later. She called our mother next because she'd apparently realized the direct approach wasn't working. I found out about the call from Carol herself, who phoned me in tears, asking why I would do something so cruel to my own sister. Renee had spun an entire narrative for our mother, that I'd always been jealous of her music career, that I'd been waiting for an excuse to steal her kids and play the hero, that Julian and I had colluded behind her back. It was a good story, in the way Renee's stories were always good, specific enough to sound plausible, emotional enough to bypass scrutiny. I didn't argue with Carol on the phone. I just sent her screenshots, the bedtime text, the stop being dramatic text, a photo I'd taken of Grady's tear-streaked face on my porch. Timestamped the afternoon it happened. Carol went quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I need to think," which from my mother was as close to an admission as I was going to get that night. That was the second ceiling, and Renee didn't even know she'd hit it because Carol never told her about the screenshots. Renee tried one more angle on me directly before she moved on to lawyers of her own. She called me on a Wednesday night, her voice softer than it had been in any of our other calls, almost gentle, in a way that should have put me on guard immediately given everything I already knew about how she operated. She said she understood why I'd done what I did, that she wasn't angry with me anymore, that she just wanted to talk sister to sister. Then she pivoted, the way she always eventually pivoted, toward what she actually wanted. "You've never gotten to really be a mom, Dana," she said. "I know that room's still empty. Maybe this could be good for both of us. You keep the kids with Julian a little longer if you have to, fine, but back me up when this goes to court. Tell the judge I'm getting better. You owe me that much, after everything we've been through together." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, genuinely stunned at the shape of what she was offering, which was, when I broke it down, an invitation to trade my testimony for the vague promise of some future closeness with Piper and Grady, dangled in front of the one wound in my life she knew went deepest. I told her no. I told her I wasn't going to lie to a judge about her parenting to fill a hole in my own life, and that using my broken engagement against me, even indirectly, was one of the ugliest things she'd done yet, in a competition that already had some steep contenders. She called me selfish and hung up, and that was the last real conversation we had before the custody hearing. The joint account I'd helped Renee open for the kids back in July became its own small battleground before any of the bigger legal machinery kicked in. It held $940, birthday and holiday money from relatives that Renee and I had agreed to keep untouched until Piper and Grady were older. 4 days after I drove the kids to Ohio, I got an automated alert on my phone, a feature I'd set up out of habit as the cosigner, flagging an attempted withdrawal of the full balance. Renee had tried to drain it that same afternoon, apparently assuming I wouldn't notice or wouldn't be positioned to stop it. Because the account required both signatures for any withdrawal over $200, the transaction failed automatically, but the attempt itself told me something I hadn't fully let myself accept yet, that this wasn't really about parenting philosophy or a music career or even pride. It was about access and control and what happened to Renee's sense of herself when either one slipped out of her hands. I called the bank the next morning and had the account frozen entirely pending the outcome of the custody case, a call that took 11 minutes and that I remember, oddly, as one of the calmest decisions I made in that entire first week. Julian's parents hired a lawyer named Vivian Cross the following week, a family law attorney out of Columbus with a reputation, Sandra told me, for moving fast when a case had real evidence behind it. Vivian requested Piper and Grady's full medical records as part of building Julian's emergency custody petition, and what came back told a story none of us had pieced together yet. Both kids were 9 months behind on vaccinations. Piper had a cavity that had gone untreated for what the dentist's notes estimated was somewhere between 4 and 6 months, visible decay that any competent parent monitoring their kids' teeth would have caught and addressed. There was a missed well-child visit for Grady in June, rescheduled twice, then never completed at all. None of it was dramatic on its own. Together, it read like a full year of a parent quietly checking out while still telling everyone, including herself, that she had everything handled. A caseworker named Micah Alvarez came to evaluate Julian's home 8 days after the kids arrived. He spent close to 2 hours there, watching Piper and Grady play in the backyard, watching them eat dinner at the table without being coaxed, watching Piper crawl into Julian's lap during a thunderstorm that rolled through that afternoon and fall asleep there within 10 minutes, completely unbothered. Micah wrote it all down, Sandra told me later, in careful, specific language. Not vague impressions, but exact observations, the kind that hold up in a courtroom. That was the third ceiling. Renee broke through that one too, in the ugliest way yet. She showed up unannounced at the Voss's house on a Saturday afternoon, 11 days after the kids had arrived, pounding on the front door hard enough that Sandra told me later she thought something had broken. Renee was screaming before the door even opened, saying her family had stolen her babies, that everyone in that house was going to regret this. Piper, who had been playing with a puzzle in the living room, walked to the doorway and looked up at her mother, and in the small, matter-of-fact voice of a 3-year-old, asked her why she left. Renee had no answer. I heard about this secondhand from Sandra, who said Renee's face did something she'd never seen a grown woman's face do before, like the question had physically knocked something loose in her. The visit ended with Piper crying, confused and overwhelmed by the volume of her own mother's voice, and Renee storming back down the driveway, shouting threats into the street loud enough that a neighbor came out onto her own porch to watch. 5 days after that, Renee posted a long, furious message on Facebook, the kind of post that reads like it was typed in one unbroken sitting at 2 in the morning. She said her own family had turned against her. She said she was being persecuted for chasing her dreams. She said Julian and I had always hated her happiness. I didn't see it until the next morning, because I'd muted her months earlier, but by the time I woke up, my phone already had 11 new messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. A woman named Priya, who'd been Renee's roommate briefly in her 20s, wrote to tell me Renee had borrowed $300 from her in 2019 and disappeared from her life entirely for 7 years, resurfacing only recently to comment comment on a photo, like nothing had happened. Another woman, a former bandmate named Court, said Renee had bailed on a shared apartment lease 4 days before move-in, leaving Court to cover the deposit alone and scramble for a new roommate in a week. Neither of them had known the other existed until Renee's post brought them both out of the woodwork at the same time. It was a pattern nobody had ever assembled into a full picture before, because Renee had always been careful to keep her messes spread out among people who didn't talk to each other. That night, for the first time, they did. Vivian filed for an emergency custody hearing the following Tuesday, and the court moved faster than any of us expected, scheduling it for 8 days later. I flew back up from Charlotte for it because Sandra asked me to be there, and because some part of me needed to see this through to whatever ending it was going to have. Renee arrived 20 minutes late, in a wrinkled button-down shirt, still making some excuse about traffic to the bailiff on her way in. Vivian stood and calmly walked the judge through everything. The text messages, the medical records, Micah's written evaluation, even at the end, a printed copy of Renee's own Facebook post, which Vivian noted for the record had been shared publicly and was therefore admissible. Micah's report got read into the record almost in full, longer than I expected any caseworker's notes to run. He'd written that Piper initiated physical affection with her father unprompted 4 separate times during his 2-hour visit. He'd written that Grady's vocabulary, when engaged directly by an attentive adult, was noticeably more advanced than his intake file had suggested, a detail Vivian highlighted as evidence that the children had simply not been getting consistent verbal engagement before the placement changed. Owen Priest, Renee's public defender, tried to object twice, once to the relevance of the Facebook post, once to Micah's qualifications to comment on developmental milestones, and Judge Holloway overruled him both times without much discussion, the second time adding that a caseworker with 11 years of field experience was well within his lane commenting on what he'd personally observed. The judge, a measured gray-haired man named Judge Holloway who didn't raise his voice once during the entire hearing, asked Renee 2 questions near the end, almost as an afterthought. He asked her Grady's birthday. She said May, then corrected herself to April, then went quiet, clearly unsure which was actually right. It was March. He asked her Piper's favorite food. Renee said pasta. Piper, sitting beside Julian in the gallery, hadn't eaten pasta willingly in over a year. Her favorite food, according to Sandra, who'd learned it within days, was green beans, plain, no butter, eaten one at a time. The room went quiet in a way courtrooms rarely do. Judge Holloway looked down at his papers for a long moment. Then he granted Julian full physical custody, effective immediately, and told Renee, in the same even tone he'd used for everything else, that this hearing was likely only the beginning of what she stood to lose. Renee's face went the color of the manila folder in front of her. She shot up so fast her chair scraped backward and crashed to the floor behind her. "You can't do this to me," she said, loud enough that the bailiff took a step forward. "I'm still their mother." Judge Holloway didn't respond to that directly. He looked back down at the file, flipped a page, then another, and his expression shifted into something none of us in that courtroom had seen on him yet that day. "Actually," he said slowly, "before we adjourn, there's something else in this file we need to discuss." Renee froze mid-breath. Vivian's pen stopped moving. I felt Sandra's hand grip my arm beside me. None of us had any idea what was coming next, and I remember thinking, in that strange suspended second, that whatever it was about to change everything again. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. What Judge Holloway had found wasn't in the medical records or the text messages Vivian had already entered into evidence. It was in a supplemental financial disclosure Vivian's office had subpoenaed almost as an afterthought. Standard procedure for any custody case involving allegations of neglect, meant mostly to establish whether Renee could financially support the children if custody went her way. I hadn't thought much about it when Vivian mentioned requesting it 3 weeks earlier. I'm a forensic accountant. I look at financial statements for a living, and even I hadn't connected the dots yet, though I'd seen a piece of the picture without realizing what it was. Back in July, 4 months before any of this happened, I'd helped Renee set up a joint savings account for the kids' future. One of those small acts of family goodwill you do without asking too many questions. While I was in her online banking with her, walking her through the setup, I noticed a recurring deposit pattern in her personal checking account that struck me, even then, as strange. Payments coming in from a payment processor called GiveWell Direct, ranging from $400 to just over $2,000, arriving roughly every 10 to 14 days, going back at least a year based on what I could see on the screen. I asked her what it was. She said, without missing a beat, that it was session fees from students she'd started teaching guitar lessons to online. I believed her, because I had no reason not to, and because the amounts were small enough, individually, not to seem like anything worth interrogating. I filed the memory away and forgot about it completely until Judge Holloway said the words "GoFundMe" out loud in that courtroom, and something in my chest went cold with recognition. The subpoenaed records showed that 14 months earlier, in August of the previous year, Renee had created a fundraising page titled "Help Hyper Fight Leukemia." She'd used a photograph of Hyper from a real hospital visit, an ear infection scare that had sent them to urgent care the same week, cropped and filtered to look more clinical than it was. Piper's face pale under fluorescent light, an IV line from a completely unrelated visit for a stomach bug spliced in from an older photo. The page described a fictional diagnosis, fictional chemotherapy sessions at a real children's hospital in Columbus, fictional setbacks, and fictional small victories, posted every few weeks in updates written with real skill. The same storytelling instinct Renee had always poured into her music, redirected into something far uglier. Over 14 months, the page raised $42,116 from 611 separate donors, strangers, former co-workers, 2 of Julian's own aunts who had each given $500, believing they were helping their great-niece survive cancer. The money hadn't gone to a single hospital bill, because there were no hospital bills to pay. It had gone into studio time at Ferris Sound, a used Ford Transit van converted for touring that Renee had purchased in February for $11,000 cash, and, based on the timeline Vivian's office reconstructed, the very deposit that had covered first and last month's rent on the garage studio space she'd been living out of when she dumped her kids on my porch. There was more. Running parallel to the fundraiser, Renee had also been receiving a monthly childcare subsidy from Ohio's Department of Job and Family Services, a program designed to help low-income working parents afford daycare so they can hold down a job. To qualify, she'd submitted paperwork claiming she worked overnight shifts at a call center, a job that, according to the records Vivian's investigator pulled, she had quit 9 months earlier without ever notifying the state. She'd continued collecting $1,100 a month in subsidy payments for daycare she wasn't paying for a job she no longer had, for hours of supposed work that overlapped suspiciously with the exact windows of time Piper and Grady's neighbors, interviewed later by Vivian's investigator, remembered seeing the kids playing unsupervised in the shared courtyard of Renee's apartment complex. The subsidy fraud alone came to just over $9,000 across 9 months. Combined with the fundraiser, Renee had extracted more than $51,000 from strangers in the state, using her own children's health and welfare as the raw material, while those same children fell behind on vaccines, developed an untreated cavity, and were, on at least one occasion I now understood in a completely different light, left in the care of a stranger from a Facebook group so their mother could take a meeting. I sat in that courtroom and felt the entire architecture of my sister rearrange itself in my mind. The $3,000 she'd borrowed from me for a transmission repair that never happened. The way she always seemed to have just enough money for studio time, but never quite enough to cover her half of daycare. The offhand comment, 18 months earlier, about a GoFundMe for a friend she'd mentioned running, which I'd assumed at the time was exactly what it sounded like. None of it had been random. It had been a system, built slowly and maintained carefully. And the 2 people who'd made the system possible, whose real medical vulnerability had given it its cover story, were the same 2 toddlers she'd left crying on my porch so she could go be, in her own words, somebody who actually shows up. I found Julian in the hallway outside the courtroom during the 10-minute recess Judge Holloway called before delivering his final ruling, and I told him what I'd started to piece together: the GoFundMe deposits I'd seen months earlier without understanding them, the recurring session fees that were never session fees at all. His face went through several things in quick succession: confusion, then something like recognition, then a kind of stillness I hadn't seen on him before. "She asked me for money in August," he said quietly, staring at a spot on the hallway carpet. "Said Piper needed a specialist appointment insurance wouldn't cover. I gave her $400. I didn't even think to ask which specialist." He laughed once, a short, humorless sound. "I paid into it too. I just didn't know I was donating to my own kid's fake charity." I didn't have anything to say to that. That wouldn't have sounded hollow, so I just stood next to him in the hallway until the bailiff called us back inside. Judge Holloway laid it out methodically, reading from the supplemental report in the same unhurried voice he'd used all afternoon, which somehow made it land harder than shouting ever could have. He read the total dollar figure out loud. He read the name of the fundraising page out loud. He noted, for the record, that the court would be referring the financial findings to both the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office and Ohio's Department of Job and Family Services Fraud Division for further investigation, separate from and in addition to the custody matter already before him. Renee sat frozen through most of it. Her lawyer, a public defender named Owen Preece, who'd clearly been handed this case with almost no preparation time, leaning over to whisper something she didn't seem to hear. When Judge Holloway finished, he looked directly at Renee for the first time in several minutes. "Ms. Voss," he said, "I've presided over a lot of custody disputes. I don't often see one where the parent's own fundraising page ends up being Exhibit F." A few people in the gallery, court staff mostly, exchanged glances. Renee finally found her voice, and what came out wasn't an apology or an explanation. It was fury. "This is insane," she said, standing again, her voice cracking upward. "I did what I had to do. Nobody was helping me. I was drowning, and none of you lifted a finger. So don't you dare sit there and judge me for finding a way to survive." She looked at me when she said it, like I was the one on trial. I hadn't planned to speak. Vivian hadn't called me as a witness. I wasn't part of the legal proceeding beyond having driven the kids to Ohio. But something in me stood up anyway, and Judge Holloway, maybe out of curiosity about who I was, or maybe just tired enough to let a small breach of courtroom procedure slide, didn't stop me. "You weren't drowning, Renee," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected it to be. "You had a sister who wired you $3,000 for a car repair that never happened. You had a mother who would have given you anything you asked for, honestly. You had a husband who paid for 4 months of studio time out of a logistics coordinator's salary because he believed in you. Nobody refused refused to help you. You just didn't want the kind of help that came with anyone actually watching what you did with it. The room was very quiet. Renee's mouth opened and closed once, like she was searching for the counter-argument and couldn't locate it. You put your daughter's face on a fundraiser for a disease she never had, I said, and I made myself keep going even though my voice wavered on the word disease. You let people believe your baby was in chemotherapy so you could buy a van. You let 2 toddlers fall behind on their shots and rot a cavity in a 3-year-old's mouth while you collected a subsidy for a job you'd already quit. And then, when all of that finally caught up with you, you drove away from your own kids laughing and told me you'd be back when Piper turned 18, like this was a lease you could walk away from and renew later on your own schedule. I stopped there because I could feel my composure starting to slip, and I didn't want the last thing I said in that courtroom to be something I couldn't stand behind later. I'm not your villain in this story, Renee. You built this. I just refuse to help you hide it anymore. Renee didn't have anything left to throw back at that. She looked for just a second like the sister I remembered from 20 years earlier, the one who used to cry in the bathroom before school because she was scared she'd get in trouble for something small, before she learned that crying and blaming someone else usually worked better than owning it. Then the moment passed, and her face hardened back into the version of her I'd come to recognize over the last 3 weeks. Sandra, standing a few feet behind me, didn't say anything to Renee at all, which I think landed harder than any confrontation could have. She just reached down and picked up the chair Renee had knocked over, set it upright against the wall with a kind of unhurried, deliberate calm, and turned to check on Julian instead, as though Renee had already finished mattering to the room. Renee watched her do it, and something in her posture seemed to register the dismissal more sharply than anything either of us had said. "You'll regret this," she said, quieter now, almost to herself as much as to me. 2 sheriff's deputies who'd been standing near the back of the courtroom, alerted earlier by the prosecutor's office once the fraud referral had been confirmed, stepped forward as the hearing adjourned. They didn't arrest her on the spot. The investigation would take another 11 days to formally charge her. But they informed her, right there in the hallway outside the courtroom, with Sandra and Julian and me all still standing close enough to hear, that she should expect contact from a detective within the week, and that she should not attempt to leave the state of Ohio in the meantime. Piper and Grady weren't in the courtroom for any of it. Sandra had kept them home that day, at the daycare co-op 2 streets over that Julian had enrolled them in. A small mercy none of us had to discuss out loud to agree on. I think about that sometimes, that the worst afternoon of Renee's adult life happened entirely without her children present to witness it, and that somehow felt right, like at least one part of this story managed to protect them from something. Renee was formally charged 11 days later, exactly as the deputies had said she would be. The Franklin County Prosecutor's Office charged her with theft by deception and telecommunications fraud tied to the GoFundMe money, and the state's fraud division separately pursued the child care subsidy overpayments as a civil matter with the possibility of criminal referral if she didn't cooperate with restitution. Her mugshot ran in a 2-paragraph piece on the local news website 3 days after the charges were filed, under a headline that used the phrase "fake cancer fundraiser," and within 48 hours the story had been picked up and reshared by 2 larger regional outlets looking for an easy, ugly headline. I didn't share it. I didn't need to. Enough of the 611 donors found it on their own, and the comment section under the original GoFundMe page, which the platform had frozen but not yet taken down, filled with a slow, furious trickle of people realizing, one by one, that the money they'd given in genuine grief and hope had bought recording equipment and diesel for a touring van. The family lines drew themselves faster than I expected, and not always in the direction I would have guessed. Our mother, Carol, called me the night the charges became public and cried for almost an hour, not in defense of Renee this time, but in a kind of grief I hadn't heard from her before. The sound of a parent realizing she'd spent 31 years believing the best about someone who had, at some point she couldn't pinpoint, stopped deserving it. She didn't cut Renee off entirely. I don't think a mother ever fully can, but she stopped answering Renee's calls for the first 2 weeks, and when she finally did take one, she told me afterward that she'd spent most of it saying almost nothing at all, just listening to Renee explain herself in circles, waiting for an apology that never actually arrived. The unexpected allies showed up in ways I couldn't have predicted the day I drove those kids to Ohio. Julian's aunts, the 2 who'd each given $500 believing they were helping a great niece survive cancer, became some of the fiercest advocates for Julian's custody case, showing up to a follow-up hearing in matching cardigans, both of them prepared to testify to the character of the home Piper and Grady were now living in if the court needed it. Court, the former bandmate who'd been left holding an apartment deposit years earlier, reached out to me directly, offering to provide a written statement about the pattern of borrowing and disappearing she'd experienced firsthand, unprompted, because, in her words, somebody needs a paper trail on this and I've got one. Even Owen Priest, the overwhelmed public defender who'd been assigned to Renee's custody case, quietly told Vivian's office after the hearing that he thought the fraud allegations, once he'd seen the documentation, were about as clear-cut as he'd ever encountered, which is not something public defenders usually volunteer about their own clients. A local reporter named Priyanka Deshmukh, who'd covered the original news brief about the charges, reached out to me directly about 3 weeks in, asking if I'd be willing to give a comment for a longer follow-up piece she was working on. I said no, mostly because I didn't want Piper and Grady's names attached to into a headline they'd have no say in for the rest of their lives, and Priyanka, to her credit, didn't push. She did end up writing the follow-up anyway, built around interviews with 3 of the defrauded donors who agreed to be named, one of whom, a retired school teacher named Alma Presser, who'd given $600 over the course of the fake fundraiser's run, reached out to Sandra afterward through a mutual church connection, not angry, just aching to know if the children were actually all right. When Sandra told her they were, Alma asked if she could send something anyway, not to Renee, but directly to Piper and Grady, a modest children's book fund she started at the Westerville Public Library in their names, seeded with $40 of her own money and a note explaining gently that sometimes good things can still come from a bad situation if enough people decide to make it so. It's a small thing, it isn't restitution, and it was never meant to be. But I think about Alma Presser more than almost anyone else in this story, a woman who lost $600 to a stranger's lie and responded, when she found out the truth, by trying to give something real to the children who'd been used to tell it. Renee's desperate moves came in a scattered, uncoordinated burst over the following month, the moves of someone who still believed on some level that the right performance could reverse what had already happened. She posted a follow-up video, tearful and carefully lit, apologizing in vague terms for mistakes, without ever naming what they were, asking her remaining online followers for understanding and, unbelievably, for continued support during what she called the hardest chapter of my life. The video got shared, but not the way she wanted. It became a minor local example of tone deafness, clipped and captioned by strangers pointing out that she still hadn't said the word fraud, still hadn't named a single donor by name to apologize to directly. She called our mother twice asking for a loan to cover a retainer for a real defense attorney, since Owen Priest's public defender assignment only covered the custody matter, not the criminal charges. Carol said no both times, the first time she'd ever said no to Renee about money in either of our lives. Renee reached out to me exactly once during that stretch, a single text sent at 1 a.m. on a Tuesday. I know you hate me right now, but I need you to understand I never meant to hurt them. I didn't respond. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time, and then I set it face down on my nightstand and went back to sleep, which felt, in its own quiet way, like the first fully settled decision I'd made since the whole thing started. There was a legal and financial tangle underneath all of it that took months to sort through, the unglamorous machinery that never makes it into the version of a story people tell out loud. Julian's custody case had to be formally finalized beyond the emergency order, which meant 3 more hearings spread across 4 months, each one requiring him to take unpaid time off from his logistics job, each one requiring Sandra or Ward to drive 2 hours each way to be present. The state's welfare fraud division placed a lien against any future earnings Renee generated, meaning the roughly $9,000 in subsidy overpayments would be clawed back slowly through wage garnishment once she found steady work again, which, given her new legal record, took her considerably longer than it might have otherwise. Restitution for the GoFundMe funds became part of her eventual plea agreement, structured as monthly payments she'd be making, based on the schedule Vivian's office told me about secondhand, for close to 9 years. Child support, once calculated against her actual, verified income, rather than the fictional overnight call center job she'd claimed on state paperwork, came out lower than anyone expected, a final, small indignity in a story already full of them. Piper started seeing a child therapist named Dr. Odalis Reyes twice a month starting in December, mostly to help her process the disruption of the move and the strange, frightening months before it. And Grady, whose speech had lagged noticeably behind other kids his age according to Micah's original evaluation, started early intervention sessions through the county that spring. By June, his vocabulary had nearly caught up to where it should have been, a fact Sandra told me over the phone with the kind of pride usually reserved for much bigger milestones, though I understood hearing it that for this particular kid, in this particular year, it was exactly that big. I offered to help cover the cost of both, and Julian, after some back and forth neither of us enjoyed, agreed to let me contribute to Grady's sessions specifically, on the condition that I stop bringing it up once it was settled, which I did. My own role in all of it shifted too, in ways I hadn't expected when I first drove those kids across 3 state lines. Vivian's investigator, once the financial trail started to take shape, asked if I'd be willing to walk through the account statements with him and flag anything that looked structurally off, given my background. I spent 4 unpaid evenings that November doing exactly the kind of work I did every day at the credit union, except this time the fraud pattern belonged to my own sister, and the victims included 2 children I'd bathed and fed and rocked to sleep myself. I don't know that I'd call it satisfying exactly, using a skill I'd built over a decade to help take apart something Renee had built over roughly the same span of time, but it felt necessary in a way very little else in that whole year did, like the one part of the story where I actually knew, without doubt, that what I was doing was right. Carol flew out to Ohio herself that January, the first time she'd met Sandra and Ward in person, despite 4 years of shared grandchildren between them. It was an awkward visit by every account I heard afterward, Carol arriving with a casserole and an apology she didn't quite know how to phrase, Sandra receiving both with a graciousness that Julian later told me surprised even him. The 2 women sat at Sandra's kitchen table for 3 hours that first afternoon, while Piper and Grady napped, and whatever was said between them, Carol came home talking about Sandra like an old friend, rather than a stranger she'd only ever heard about secondhand through a daughter who'd spent years minimizing realizing how much those grandparents actually did. Carol visits twice a year now, driving up from Charlotte with me sometimes, and she keeps a photo of all 4 kids, Piper and Grady included, on her refrigerator next to one of Renee and me at roughly the same ages. A small, quiet act of refusing to let either half of the family disappear from the other. I had my own quiet moment of grief in the middle of all this, one that surprised me with how sharp it was. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, about 6 weeks after the courtroom hearing, when I was helping Sandra go through a box of old photos Julian had asked her to dig up for Piper's preschool family tree project. There was a picture near the bottom of the box of Renee and me at maybe 7 and 4 years old, sitting on our mother's front steps in matching sundresses Carol had sewn herself, both of us missing the same front tooth, both of us laughing at something outside the frame that neither of us would remember decades later. I sat on Sandra's guest bed and cried for the first time since this whole thing started, not for the sister who'd left 2 toddlers screaming on my porch, but for the 7-year-old in that photo, who I genuinely believe never set out to become someone capable of what Renee eventually did. Something real had existed between us once. I wasn't ready, even with everything I now knew, to pretend it hadn't. I still don't think I have to pretend that, to hold both things true at the same time. That I loved my sister, and that I was never going to let her near those kids again without a court order and a great deal of supervision standing between them. It's been a little over a year now since Renee's car pulled away from my curb on Larchwood Court. Piper is 4.5. Grady just turned 3. They live with Julian full-time in a rented house 8 minutes from Sandra and Ward's place in Westerville, close enough that Piper walks to her grandparents' porch some afternoons on her own 2 feet, trailed by Julian a few steps behind, pretending not to hover. I fly up from Charlotte once a month now, sometimes more, and I've learned Piper's actual favorite food myself, firsthand, because she informed me of it very seriously over dinner the first time I visited. Green beans, plain, no butter, eaten one at a time, exactly as Sandra had said. Grady still doesn't sleep through the night every single time, but he does most nights, and when he doesn't, there's always someone in that house who gets up without complaint. I finally painted that spare room, the one that sat primer gray for 6 years after Corbin and I ended things. It's a soft yellow now, picked out by Piper herself, from 3 swatches I held up against the wall on a video call. And there's a toddler bed in there for Grady, and a daybed for Piper for the 2 long weekends a year Julian lets them fly down to see me. It isn't the nursery I once imagined for it, and I've made a kind of peace with that difference. The way you make peace with a plan that didn't happen so a different, unplanned good thing could happen instead. Renee never knew, and will probably never know, that the room she once tried to use against me eventually became exactly what she accused me of wanting all along, just not on the terms she offered, and not because I traded anything to get it. Renee is 2 years into her restitution schedule. She works retail now, a job she's held longer than any job I remember her having before, which her parole officer apparently considers a promising sign. She calls the kids on a supervised video schedule twice a month, 30 minutes each, monitored by a family services coordinator per the terms Vivian's office negotiated. I've heard secondhand through Carol that the calls are mostly quiet. Piper answering questions in short sentences. Grady more interested in whatever toy is nearby than in the screen. I don't know if that will change as they get older. I don't know if it should. That's not really my decision to make anymore. And there's a strange relief in that, in finally having a piece of this story that isn't mine to carry. I think often about the difference between the sister who taught me to ride a bike in a church parking lot when I was 6 years old, patient in a way she rarely got credit for, and the woman who looked at her own children crying on a stranger's porch and drove away laughing. I used to think those were 2 different people, that somewhere along the way one had replaced the other. I don't think that anymore. I think they were always the same person, someone capable of real tenderness and real cruelty in the same lifetime, sometimes in the same year, and the hardest part of loving her was never being able to predict, on any given day, which version was going to show up. That uncertainty is its own kind of grief, separate from anything a courtroom can resolve. I lost a sister I could trust a long time before I ever found out about the fundraiser, I think. I just didn't have the evidence yet to know it. Julian and I talk most weeks now, mostly logistics, flight times, and school forms, but sometimes about nothing in particular. The easy kind of conversation that happens between people who went through something hard together and came out the other side still able to stand each other. He told me once, almost apologetically, that he still struggles to understand how he missed so much of it while it was happening, how a person can share a bed with someone for years and not see the architecture underneath. I told him what I've come to believe myself, that Renee built her whole life to be missed, carefully, on purpose, and that noticing it sooner would have required a kind of suspicion neither of us was built to carry into a marriage or a sibling relationship. Trust isn't naivety, it's just trust, functioning exactly as it's supposed to, until someone decides to use it as raw material for something else. What I've learned, watching Piper eat her green beans one at a time and watching Grady fall asleep mid-sentence in Julian's lap the way he used to fall asleep in mine, is that showing up isn't a grand gesture. It isn't a single dramatic act, a courtroom moment, a viral post exposing the truth. It's Tuesday. It's remembering a kid's favorite food without having to be told twice. It's answering the phone at 6 in the morning because someone might need you, and getting in the car before you finish thinking it through. My sister promised she'd come back when Piper turned 18, like childhood was a storage unit she could pay off later on her own schedule. She isn't going to get the chance, not the way she imagined it, and I don't think that's cruelty on my part, or on Julian's, or on the courts. I think it's just what happens eventually, when you mistake the people who love you for people who will wait forever, no matter how many times you drive away laughing. Piper won't remember most of this. I hope someday when she asks, I'll be able to tell her the truth plainly, the way her father always answered the door. I hope by then it will read less like a wound and more like the plain, quiet fact of who actually showed up.